The dark auction. The room was dimly lit, shadows dancing across the metallic walls. Rows of strange beings sat in elevated seats, their eyes glowing with greed and curiosity. The air buzzed with murmurs in countless alien languages, all discussing the latest prize. A young girl named Lyra. She stood on the raised platform in the center, trembling under the cold, unfeeling lights that seemed to pierce her very soul. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't belong here, in this terrifying place filled with monsters who traded lives like currency. Her own family, the ones she trusted most, had brought her here. They stood to the side, their faces blank and emotionless. Her mother, once warm and protective, now avoided her gaze. Her father, stoic and distant, watched the auctioneer begin the bidding with a calmness that made her stomach churn. They had betrayed her, sold her like a piece of furniture. The auctioneer, a tall and wiry alien with silver skin and glowing red eyes, raised a long metallic rod, tapping it against the ground. The sound echoed loudly, silencing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in a deep mechanical voice, "our final item for tonight, a rare, unblemished humanoid specimen. Young, healthy, and highly adaptable. Starting bid, 50,000 credits." Lyra flinched as the audience erupted in a frenzy. Hands and tentacles shot into the air, voices overlapping as the bids climbed higher and higher. Her knees felt weak, but she couldn't collapse. Not here. Not in front of these creatures who saw her as nothing more than an object to be bought and sold. She scanned the crowd, hoping for a miracle. Maybe someone would save her. Maybe someone would stop this nightmare. But all she saw were cold, calculating faces, except for one. In the far corner, leaning against the wall, was a figure unlike the others. He was human, like her, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to blend into the shadows. His face was partially obscured, but she could see his eyes, sharp and focused, locked on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't raise his hand to bid. He didn't join the chaos. He simply watched. 100,000 credits, shouted a bulky alien with green scales and 3 eyes. He grinned, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "She's mine." 120,000, countered a sleek, feline-like creature with golden fur and piercing blue eyes. "You don't have the resources to keep her." The auctioneer smirked, clearly enjoying the escalating competition. "Do I hear 130,000? He called out, his voice dripping with anticipation. Lyra's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs refused to move. Her wrists were bound with shimmering cuffs that sapped her strength, leaving her helpless. The thought of being taken by any of these creatures filled her with dread, but the humans she had once hoped might save her were nowhere to be found, except for the silent figure in the corner. As the bid soared higher, the man shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing. He pulled a small device from his pocket, glancing at it before slipping it back. Was he just another bidder, waiting for the right moment? Or was he something else entirely? 150,000 credits, roared the green-scaled alien, slamming his massive hand on the railing in triumph. The crowd erupted in cheers and groans as it became clear no one else could outbid him. The auctioneer clapped his hands together, his metallic grin widening. "Sold," he declared, "to the esteemed Grachner of the Trevelyan Syndicate." Lyra's heart sank as the guards moved to escort her off the platform. Grachner rose from his seat, his hulking form towering over the others. He gave her a predatory smile, already imagining the ways he could exploit his new purchase. But before the guards could lead her away, the lights flickered. A low hum filled the air, followed by a sharp crackle. The audience murmured in confusion, some rising from their seats. The auctioneer's confident expression faltered. "What is the meaning of this?" Grachner bellowed, his voice echoing through the hall. He turned toward the guards, but they were already moving to investigate the disturbance. In the chaos, the human figure in the corner vanished, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. Lyra's eyes darted around, searching for him, but he was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, she thought she had imagined him, but then she noticed something strange. The shimmering cuffs around her wrists began to flicker, the energy fading. A guard rushed toward her, but before he could reach the platform, a small round device rolled across the floor. It stopped near his feet, blinking red. His eyes widened in realization, but it was too late. The device exploded with a blinding flash of light, sending him flying backward. The room descended into chaos. Alarms blared, and the audience scrambled to escape. Lyra stumbled back, her vision blurred from the explosion. When she opened her eyes, the mysterious human was there, crouched beside her. He reached out, his voice low and urgent. "Come with me if you want to live." Lyra hesitated for only a second before nodding. She didn't know who he was or why he was helping her, but he was her only chance. Gripping his hand tightly, she let him pull her to her feet. Together, they vanished into the chaos, leaving the auction hall in disarray. For the first time in days, Lyra felt a spark of hope. The deal is made. The eerie silence that followed the auction's end felt heavier than the noise before it. Lyra stood frozen, staring at the hulking alien who now owned her. Grackner's wide grin stretched across his scaled face, his 3 eyes scanning her like a prized possession. The other bidders grumbled as they filed out, disappointed but unwilling to challenge him. The guards pulled Lyra forward, but her gaze lingered on the empty corner where the mysterious human had been. The lights above flickered faintly again. Lyra's heart quickened. Grackner leaned over, whispering something to the auctioneer as credits transferred from his device with a metallic chime. The auctioneer smiled thinly, shaking his hand with a nod. Lyra watched their exchange with dread pooling in her stomach. This wasn't just a simple purchase, it felt personal. As Grackner turned to leave, the guards shoved Lyra forward roughly. She stumbled, biting her lip to stop herself from crying out. Showing weakness in front of them felt dangerous, like inviting a predator closer. The auctioneer's mechanical voice echoed again. "Enjoy your prize, Grackner. She's a rare one." Grackner chuckled darkly, glancing at Lyra with a gleam in his eyes. "I know, and she's going to make me a fortune." His words made Lyra's skin crawl. The walk to the ship. The corridors leading out of the auction house were dim and damp, the air thick with the smell of rust and oil. Lyra's hands were still bound, but the cuffs were weaker now, flickering in and out like a dying light. She tried to hide the change, keeping her wrists low. Grackner led the way, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly. His guards followed closely behind Lyra, their weapons lazily slung across their chests. She could feel their eyes on her. But even as they moved further from the auction hall, Lyra sensed something, or someone, watching. A shadow danced at the edge of her vision, disappearing before she could focus on it. Her pulse quickened. Was it him? "Stop dragging your feet," one of the guards snapped, jabbing her in the back. Lyra winced but kept walking. Ahead, Grackner's ship loomed, sleek and black, resting in the private docking bay like a predator ready to pounce. Lyra's stomach twisted. Once she was inside, escape would become impossible. The transaction. At the base of the ship's ramp, a smaller alien with sunken eyes approached Grackner. They exchanged brief words, and the smaller alien handed Grackner a datapad. As Grackner reviewed the documents, Lyra noticed the shadow again. This time, closer. The human. He was crouched behind a stack of cargo crates, watching. His eyes met hers for the briefest moment, and he placed a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. Her heart pounded loudly in her ears. Grackner's voice pulled her back. "Take her to the lower bay. Lock her in with the others until we reach the station." The guards grabbed her arms, and Lyra felt panic rising. She cast a desperate glance back at the crates, but the human was gone. Had she imagined him? The hold. The lower bay of Grackner's ship was colder than the corridors, filled with the hum of machinery and faint, muffled cries. Lyra's eyes adjusted to the dim light, as the guards shoved her inside a metal cell. The door hissed shut behind her. She wasn't alone. In the corner sat two other alien children, younger than her. Their wide eyes stared at her, filled with the same fear she felt. What is this place?" Lyra whispered. The older of the two shook his head. "Graknor trades us," he murmured, "to whoever pays the most. He's been doing it for years." Lyra's throat tightened. "I tried to run once," the younger one said softly. "They don't like that." He pulled back his sleeve, revealing a scar along his arm. Lyra clenched her fists. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. Suddenly, the ship's lights flickered again. This time, they stayed off longer. A faint clatter echoed from somewhere in the bay, like someone moving quickly and carefully through the shadows. Then the cell door clicked. Lyra froze, her breath catching in her throat as the door creaked open. The two children backed away, terrified. A figure slipped inside the bay, moving silently. It was him, the human. "You?" Lyra whispered, hardly believing her eyes. He knelt by the door, holding a small device that pulsed faintly in his hand. "I told you," he said in a low voice. "I'm getting you out of here." Lyra stared at him. "Why?" His expression hardened, but there was warmth behind his eyes. "Because someone has to." Behind them, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. The guards were returning. The human glanced toward the sound and then back at Lyra. "Come on," he whispered, motioning for her to follow. Lyra hesitated only for a second before stepping out of the cell. The two children hesitated, but the human's calm nod gave them the courage to move. Together, they slipped into the shadows of the lower bay, disappearing just as the guards returned to find the empty cell door swinging open. The human rescuer. The narrow corridors of Graknor's ship twisted like a labyrinth, cold and unforgiving. Metal groaned softly beneath Lyra's bare feet as she followed the mysterious human deeper into the shadows, her heart pounding loud enough that she feared the guards might hear it. Behind her, the two smaller alien children trailed quietly, their eyes wide with fear but filled with hope. The human moved like a ghost, silent, purposeful. Every step he took seemed calculated, as if he had walked these halls before. Lyra struggled to keep up, her weakened legs shaking beneath her. She had so many questions, but the words stuck in her throat. Finally, she couldn't hold it in. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely louder than a breath. The man glanced over his shoulder but didn't stop. His face was partially hidden by a hood, but Lyra could see his eyes, sharp, alert, constantly scanning for danger. "Ethan," he replied simply. Lyra waited for more, but he offered nothing else. "What are you doing here?" she pressed, lowering her voice even further. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan paused at an intersection, listening for footsteps. When none came, he continued forward. "Graknor's been on my list for a long time," he said, his tone neutral but edged with something deeper, anger, maybe. "I've been tracking his movements for months." Lyra's brow furrowed. "List? What list?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he led them to a small access hatch in the wall. He knelt, pulling out a tool that shimmered faintly under the dim light. A hatch hissed softly as he opened it. "You're not the first," Ethan finally said, his voice lower. "Graknor's been smuggling people across the outer colonies for years. Children, adults, anyone he can sell. I couldn't save the others, but I can save you." Lyra stared at him, unsure of how to respond. A part of her wanted to trust him, to believe in the kindness he was offering. But another part, one that had been betrayed by her own family, hesitated. "Why not just buy me at the auction?" she asked. Ethan's eyes flicked up to hers, and for the first time, she saw the hint of a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "I don't negotiate with traffickers." Into the vents. Ethan gestured to the hatch. "Go. It leads to the maintenance crawl spaces. It's tight, but the guards won't look for us there." Lyra hesitated, peering into the dark tunnel. It looked barely wide enough to crawl through. "Do you trust me?" Ethan asked, his voice softer now. She met his gaze. Something in his eyes, a quiet determination, pushed away her doubt. "Yes," she said, surprising even herself. Lyra crawled inside, the cold metal biting into her skin. The two smaller children followed, squeezing in beside her. Ethan entered last, pulling the hatch closed behind them. The faint click of the lock sliding back into place echoed through the narrow tunnel. As they crawled forward, Lyra's mind raced. The air in the vent was thin, filled with the faint scent of oil and rust. Ethan led the way, guiding them left and right at various intersections, as if he had memorized every turn. "How do you know your way around this ship?" Lyra whispered after what felt like forever. Ethan's voice drifted back to her. "I was here once before. A long time ago." Lyra frowned. "Grakner captured you." "No," Ethan replied. "But someone I cared about was taken. I tried to stop it. I failed." The tunnel fell silent after that, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Lyra didn't push further. The control room. After nearly 20 minutes of crawling, Ethan stopped. He pressed his ear against the metal and waited. Lyra held her breath, listening to the distant hum of machinery. Ethan twisted a latch and carefully slid open another small hatch. Light flooded into the vent, and Lyra blinked against the brightness. They emerged into a dimly lit control room filled with monitors displaying various parts of the ship. The screens flickered with green data streams, some showing guards patrolling the halls. One screen, larger than the rest, displayed the docking bay. Grakner's ship was still stationary, but Lyra could see preparations underway for departure. "We don't have long," Ethan said, moving swiftly to a console. His fingers danced across the controls. "Grakner will realize you're missing soon." Lyra approached the monitors, her eyes drawn to the docking bay footage. Grakner stood at the base of the ship, speaking to a group of guards. He looked angry. "What are you doing?" she asked Ethan, watching as he navigated the ship's systems. "Locking them out," he replied. "I'm sealing the lower decks. That should slow them down." Lyra's eyes widened. "Won't they notice?" "They will," Ethan admitted. "But by the time they figure it out, we'll be gone." A dangerous plan. Ethan moved to a separate monitor, pulling up a map of the ship. He pointed to a section near the docking bay. "There's an escape pod here," he said. "Small, but it'll get us off this ship." Lyra glanced nervously at the screen. "Won't they chase us?" "Probably," Ethan admitted with a smirk. "But I've disabled their long-range scanners. They won't find us until we're too far away." Before Lyra could respond, the room's comm system crackled to life. "Security breach in lower bay. Subject has escaped." Grakner's voice boomed through the speakers. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Time's up. Let's move." He took Lyra's hand, guiding her quickly through the control room and out into the corridors. The two children followed closely behind, their small footsteps echoing faintly. As they hurried toward the escape pod, Lyra glanced at Ethan. Despite the danger, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. The daring escape. The corridor stretched ahead like an endless tunnel, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. Ethan led the way, his steps silent and measured, while Lyra and the two smaller children hurried behind him. The metal grated beneath their bare feet, cold and unforgiving. The ship trembled faintly as the engines roared to life, signaling that Grakner's crew was preparing for takeoff. Time was running out. "We're close," Ethan whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "The escape pod is just ahead. Stay low and keep quiet." Lyra nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. She clutched the hand of the smallest child, a girl no older than 5 with pale blue skin and wide, frightened eyes. The other child, a boy with dark, ridged scales along his arms, stayed close to Ethan's side. The hallway branched off into multiple paths, each one darker and more ominous than the last. Ethan paused at an intersection, holding up a hand. Lyra stopped abruptly, pulling the children behind a nearby crate for cover. Footsteps echoed from the left corridor, heavy and purposeful. 2 guards emerged, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders, as they spoke in hushed tones. "I thought they sealed this section," one of them muttered, eyes scanning the corridor lazily. "They did," the other replied, frowning. "But Grackner's furious. He's ordered a full sweep of the ship. He wants the girl found before we leave orbit." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She felt Ethan tense beside her, his gaze sharp and calculating. The guards paused mere meters away, glancing briefly down the hall Ethan was about to lead them through. "Let's check the storage bay," one guard said, turning to leave. The other hesitated, his eyes lingering on the darkened corridor ahead. Lyra held her breath, pressing her back against the crate, willing herself to become invisible. A long silence stretched between them before the second guard finally sighed and followed his companion. The moment they disappeared around the corner, Ethan exhaled softly. "Let's move." Reaching the pod. The escape pod bay was smaller than Lyra had imagined, tucked away behind layers of bulkheads and security locks. A circular window at the far end revealed the expanse of space, cold and vast, just beyond the ship's hull. Ethan approached the control panel, tapping quickly on the screen. A soft hiss filled the room as the pod's door slid open, revealing the compact interior. "Get in," Ethan said firmly, motioning for the children. The 2 small aliens hesitated, glancing nervously at Lyra. She gave them a reassuring nod, gently guiding them inside. The pod was cramped but safe, with enough space for all of them to sit shoulder to shoulder. Ethan knelt by the entrance, scanning the hallway behind them one last time. "Ethan," Lyra whispered, "aren't you coming?" He hesitated, his hand lingering on the edge of the pod. "I need to make sure Grackner can't follow us." Lyra's eyes widened. But before she could protest, the faint crackle of the ship's intercom interrupted her. "Security teams, lock down all escape routes. I want them found." Grackner's voice echoed through the chamber. Ethan's expression hardened. Change of plans. He pulled out a small device from his pocket, a compact cylindrical object that pulsed faintly with blue light. He twisted the top, activating it. "What is that?" Lyra asked, eyes narrowing. "A surprise," Ethan said, sliding it into the corner of the room. "It'll scramble their sensors long enough for us to get out of range." He stepped inside the pod, sealing the door behind them. The small chamber filled with the soft hum of engines coming to life as Ethan navigated the controls. The chase begins. Through the pod's window, Lyra watched as Grackner's ship grew smaller. The escape pod drifted silently away, blending into the debris field orbiting the planet below. Ethan's hands moved swiftly over the controls, guiding the pod toward the planet's surface. "We'll head for the outer colonies," he said. "Grackner won't risk following us there." Lyra nodded, but her relief was short-lived. The console beeped sharply, drawing Ethan's attention. His brow furrowed. "They've detected us," he muttered. "Grackner's deploying pursuit crafts." Lyra's stomach twisted. "Can we outrun them?" Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. "We can try." The pod's thrusters roared to life, propelling them toward the planet's atmosphere. Behind them, 2 sleek, black ships broke away from Grackner's vessel, closing the distance fast. "Hold on," Ethan warned. The pod shuddered violently as the atmosphere thickened around them, flames licking at the edges of the window. Ethan's grip tightened on the controls, his eyes fixed ahead. "They're gaining," Lyra said, fear creeping into her voice. Ethan's gaze flickered to the sensor panel. "We just need to reach the cloud cover. If we can disappear into the storm, they'll lose us." Outside, lightning crackled in the dense clouds below, illuminating the planet's surface in flashes of white and blue. The pod dove sharply, skimming the edge of the storm. The pursuing crafts followed, their weapons locking on. Suddenly, the small device Ethan had left behind on Grackner's ship activated. A bright flash of light erupted from the escape pod bay, followed by a massive energy pulse that rippled across the ship's sensors. The pursuing crafts faltered. Their systems flickered, confused by the burst of interference. Ethan seized the moment. The pod surged forward, disappearing into the storm below. A safe landing. The pod touched down on the surface, skidding across a barren, rocky plain before finally coming to a halt. Steam hissed from the vents as the engines powered down. Ethan exhaled deeply, leaning back against the seat. We made it. Lyra looked out at the vast, open landscape. The storm raged in the distance, masking their descent. For the first time since the auction, she felt free. Ethan turned to the children. You're safe now. I promise. Lyra met his gaze, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. Ethan gave her a small smile. It's not over yet, but we'll face whatever comes next, together. Lyra's secret. The wind howled across the barren landscape, carrying grains of sand that scratched against the escape pod's window. Lyra sat near the edge of the cramped interior, watching as Ethan scanned the horizon. The two alien children huddled together, quietly sleeping against the curved wall. They had landed in the middle of nowhere, an empty, desert-like expanse stretching far into the distance. Jagged mountains rose faintly in the background, shrouded by low, swirling clouds. The storm they'd escaped into had passed, but Grachner's ships would no doubt be searching. Ethan paced the pod, checking the systems panel for the third time. Lyra's eyes followed him, curiosity gnawing at her. Why aren't we leaving? She finally asked. Ethan stopped, his hand lingering over the console. We need to stay hidden until I'm sure Grachner's ships are out of orbit, he said, not looking up. If we take off too soon, they'll detect us. Lyra frowned. And if they find us here? Ethan finally met her gaze, his expression calm but serious. Then we fight. The word sent a chill down Lyra's spine. She wasn't sure if he was trying to comfort her or warn her. A strange feeling. As silence settled over the pod, Lyra's mind drifted. She thought about Grachner, about the auction, and about the strange, burning sensation she'd felt when the cuffs around her wrists had flickered and died. Lyra glanced down at her hands. They looked normal, small, pale, trembling slightly from exhaustion, but something felt different inside her. Ethan noticed her staring. You okay? She hesitated. I don't know, she admitted quietly. Back on the ship, when you found me, the cuffs just stopped working. Ethan narrowed his eyes, stepping closer. What do you mean? I didn't do anything. Lyra continued, shaking her head. But right before you opened the cell, I felt something. It was like the energy in the cuffs just shut down. Ethan crouched in front of her, his eyes sharp and focused. Lyra, he said carefully, that kind of tech doesn't just stop working on its own. Lyra opened her mouth to respond, but a sudden spark of static crackled between her fingertips. She yelped, pulling her hands back. The spark faded as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan's gaze flickered to her hands, his expression unreadable. Do that again. I didn't mean to, Lyra said, clutching her fingers. Try, Ethan urged, leaning forward. Lyra stared at her hands, concentrating. A faint hum filled the air around her, and for a brief moment, a small flicker of blue light danced between her palms. She gasped, jerking her hands apart as the light faded. The two alien children stirred but remained asleep. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. Well, he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. That explains a few things. Lyra stared at him. Explains what? Ethan exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. Grachner doesn't just trade people, Lyra. He traffics rare species, beings with unusual abilities. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. But I'm human. Maybe not entirely, Ethan said, glancing at her. Or maybe you're something more than just human. The thought made Lyra's head spin. She had always believed she was normal, ordinary. The betrayal by her family had been painful enough. But now this. I don't understand, she whispered, curling her fingers into fists. Why didn't I know about this? Ethan's gaze softened. Sometimes people hide things to protect us, he said gently, or to protect themselves. Lyra's eyes darkened. My family wasn't protecting me. They sold me. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He sat back, crossing his arms as he leaned against the console. Maybe, he said after a long pause, or maybe they were scared of what you might become. Uncovering the truth. The next hour passed in silence. Lyra sat quietly, processing Ethan's words. The children remained asleep, their soft breathing the only sound within the pod. Ethan kept his eyes on the scanners, watching for any signs of Grakner's ships. But Lyra could tell he was thinking about her, about what had happened back on the ship. Finally, she broke the silence. Do you think I could stop them? She asked hesitantly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Grakner's men. Lyra shook her head. The cuffs, the guards. I mean, if I tried, could I make their weapons stop working? Ethan considered her words carefully. I don't know, he admitted. But if what happened before was any indication, you might be able to. Lyra looked down at her hands again, feeling the faint hum beneath her skin. What if I can't control it? She whispered. Ethan's voice softened. Then I'll help you. The words hung in the air, and for the first time since they'd escaped, Lyra felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. But as Ethan returned to the scanners, his expression darkened. Lyra noticed this shift immediately. What is it? She asked. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Grakner's ship. It's entering the atmosphere. Lyra's heart sank. They're still looking for us. A final stand. The escape pod's dim interior was suffocating as the scanner's soft beeping echoed in the silence. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the screen, tracking the slow descent of Grakner's ship as it pierced through the planet's atmosphere. Lyra clenched her fists, feeling the faint hum of energy beneath her skin again, a reminder of the power she didn't understand. The two alien children, still groggy from sleep, sat quietly by the window, unaware of the looming danger. They found us, Lyra whispered, watching as Ethan adjusted the controls. Not yet, he replied, though his voice lacked confidence. But they're getting close. Too close. Through the narrow viewport, Lyra could see the faint glint of Grakner's ship cutting through the clouds. It wasn't alone. Two smaller vessels flanked it, skimming the surface as they searched the barren landscape. What do we do? She asked, her heart pounding. Ethan's jaw tightened. We run. The chase begins. Ethan slammed his hand on the pod's release mechanism, and with a soft hiss, the outer door slid open. The desert stretched out before them, endless and desolate. The wind whipped against Lyra's face as she stepped out, blinking against the harsh light. Move fast, Ethan ordered, scooping up the youngest child in one arm. The other child clung to Lyra's hand, his small legs struggling to keep up as they sprinted across the rocky terrain. Behind them, the pod sank silently into the sand, leaving no trace of their landing. But Lyra knew it wouldn't matter. Grakner's men wouldn't stop until they were found. Where are we going? She asked, breathless. There's a ridge up ahead, Ethan said, pointing to the jagged cliffs in the distance. We'll lose them in the canyon. Lyra glanced back over her shoulder. The two smaller crafts had peeled away from Grakner's main ship, now flying dangerously low over the desert floor. They're scanning the surface, Ethan muttered. Stay low. The four of them ducked behind a rocky outcrop, pressing themselves flat against the uneven surface. Lyra felt the vibrations of the ships passing overhead, their engines humming faintly as they swept across the desert. Ethan set the younger child down, peeking around the edge of the rock. They're circling, he said grimly. We can't outrun them forever, Lyra whispered, fear tightening in her chest. No, Ethan admitted, but we don't have to. The plan. Ethan knelt in front of Lyra, his eyes calm but focused. I need you to do something for me, he said quietly. Lyra swallowed. What? Remember what happened back on Grackner's ship? The cuffs, the cell door. You did something, Lyra. You shut them down. I need you to do it again. Her eyes widened. I don't know how. You do, Ethan insisted. You just haven't learned to control it yet. But I've seen it, and so has Grackner. That's why he wants you back. Lyra took a shaky breath, glancing at her trembling hands. What if I can't? Ethan's expression softened. Then I'll keep them busy. But I believe you can. For a moment, Lyra hesitated. The weight of the situation pressed down on her. But then she saw the fear in the children's eyes, the same fear she'd felt when she stood on that auction platform. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. I'll try, she whispered. Ethan nodded, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. That's all I ask. The confrontation. The ships descended lower, their shadows growing larger as they approached the ridge. Ethan motioned for the group to move, guiding them toward the canyon's entrance. But as they neared the narrow passage, the engines behind them roared to life. They saw us. Lyra shouted. Ethan spun around, his eyes narrowing as one of the crafts banked sharply, cutting them off from the ridge. The second ship hovered behind them, blocking their escape. A metallic voice crackled through the comm system. Surrender now, or be destroyed. Ethan's hand instinctively moved to the small pistol strapped to his side, but Lyra grabbed his arm. Wait, she said, stepping forward. The guards aboard the ship sneered, lowering their weapons as they recognized her. There you are, one of them said. Grackner's been looking for you. Lyra ignored him, focusing instead on the ship's engine, its faint hum vibrating through the air. She could feel it, like a current running beneath her skin. Lyra, Ethan began, but she raised her hand, cutting him off. A strange calm washed over her. She extended her palm toward the hovering ship, closing her eyes. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and then silence. The ship's engine sputtered, flickering violently before cutting out completely. The craft wobbled, dropping several feet before stabilizing. What the? The guard stammered, slamming his fist against the control panel. Ethan's eyes widened. It's working, he whispered. Lyra kept her focus, sweat dripping down her brow. The second craft, still behind them, began to lower its weapons, ready to fire. Lyra, Ethan shouted. She turned sharply, raising her other hand toward the second ship. The energy surged faster this time, crackling around her fingertips before leaping toward the ship like a bolt of lightning. The vessel's lights flickered, and its targeting system powered down. Impossible, one of the guards muttered. Ethan wasted no time. He scooped up the child beside him and motioned for Lyra to follow. Let's go. They sprinted toward the canyon, leaving the disabled ships behind. A moment of peace. As they reached the safety of the ridge, Lyra finally allowed herself to breathe. Ethan set the children down gently, leaning against the rocky wall. You did it, he said, glancing at her with admiration. Lyra wiped her forehead, feeling the faint spark still lingering in her hands. I don't know how, she admitted. You will, Ethan replied with a grin. And next time, you'll be ready. For the first time in days, Lyra felt something she hadn't before: control. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. A new beginning. The canyon walls loomed high above them, casting long shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. Lyra sat near the mouth of a shallow cave, watching the sky fade into twilight. Ethan was a few feet away, quietly dismantling the remains of a stolen comm device from Grackner's guards. The two alien children lay curled beneath a tattered blanket, fast asleep, their faces peaceful for the first time in days. The wind that swept through the canyon was cold but calm. For the first time since her escape, Lyra felt a strange sense of peace, but deep down, she knew it wouldn't last. Ethan hadn't said much since they fled into the canyon. He was always watching, scanning the sky, listening for ships that might still be hunting them. Lyra broke the silence. "Do you think he's still looking for me?" she asked, wrapping her arms around her knees. Ethan didn't look up. "Graknor," he said, twisting a wire loose from the comm. "Absolutely." Lyra's heart sank. "I thought we disabled his ships." "We did," Ethan replied, tossing aside a scrap of metal. "But Graknor's not the type to give up. He'll regroup. And next time, he'll send more than a couple of scout ships." Lyra stared at the ground, her fingers tracing patterns in the sand. "Then what do we do?" Ethan finally looked at her, his expression softer now. "We keep moving," he said simply. "There's a place far beyond the outer colonies, a sanctuary. People like us go there to disappear." Lyra glanced at the children. "And them?" "They'll come too," Ethan said. "Graknor's not just after you. He's been trafficking kids like them for years. I've spent half my life trying to stop him." Lyra met his gaze. "Why?" Ethan's eyes darkened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something painful beneath his calm exterior. "Because I couldn't save the first one," he said quietly. "But I can save you." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. Lyra didn't press further. She could see it in his eyes. This fight was personal for him. The long night. As the last rays of light faded from the sky, Ethan stood and stretched. "Get some rest," he said, nodding toward the cave. "I'll keep watch." Lyra hesitated. "Aren't you tired?" Ethan smiled faintly. "I've been more tired before." Despite his words, she could see the exhaustion etched into his face, but she didn't argue. She lay down beside the children, pulling the blanket over them. The rocky ground was uncomfortable, but the rhythmic sound of the wind lulled her into a light sleep. Hours passed. In her dreams, she saw flashes of the auction. The blinding lights, Graknor's leering face, the cold grip of the cuffs on her wrists. But woven into those memories was something else, a hum of energy, a spark of power she couldn't explain. When she woke, the cave was bathed in pale moonlight. Ethan sat at the edge, staring out at the stars. Lyra rose quietly, stepping beside him. "Couldn't sleep?" Ethan asked without looking at her. Lyra shook her head. "I keep thinking about what you said, about the others Graknor took." Ethan sighed. "I've tracked him for years," he admitted. "But there are too many ships, too many trade routes. I'm just one person." Lyra hesitated, then sat down beside him. "What if you're not?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Not what?" "Just one person," Lyra said, her voice steady. "What if I helped you?" Ethan stared at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. "It's dangerous," he warned. "Graknor's not the only one out there. There are worse people, worse things." "I know," Lyra replied, "but I can stop them." She held out her hand, and for the briefest moment, a soft blue spark flickered at her fingertips. Ethan's eyes widened slightly, but a slow smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe you can," he said softly. The journey ahead. By morning, the canyon was quiet. Ethan packed what little they had scavenged, strapping the stolen comm device to his belt. The two children clung to Lyra's side, still wary of the vast desert stretching beyond the canyon walls. Ethan knelt in front of them, his voice gentle but firm. "We're heading for the outer colonies. It'll take a few days on foot, but there's a trading post nearby. From there, we can get transport." Lyra glanced toward the horizon, where faint mountains rose in the distance. And then, Ethan stood, shielding his eyes from the rising sun. "Then we disappear," he said simply. The group set off, walking in silence. Lyra felt the heat of the sun on her back, the weight of the past slowly lifting from her shoulders with each step forward. As they crested a hill, she paused, glancing back one last time at the place where Graknor's ships had searched for them. She wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready. Epilogue. The signal. High above the desert, Graknor's main ship hovered silently, its sleek black hull reflecting the morning light. In the command room, Graknor stood with his arms crossed, staring at a holoscreen that flickered faintly. A distorted image appeared, one of Lyra, standing beside Ethan near the canyon's entrance. Grackner's eyes narrowed. "She's stronger than I expected," he growled. Beside him, a thin alien with a long, serpentine neck hissed softly. "Should we pursue them?" Grackner's lips curled into a sinister smile. "Let them run," he said. "They won't get far. She'll come to me in time." He turned away from the screen, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "This is far from over."